reached out to push the door open further, their hand trembling slightly. But before they could touch it, the sound stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. The stillness was so thick, so complete, that even their breathing seemed too loud. The protagonist stepped back, shaking their head. "It's just an old building. Everything has a logical explanation," they told themselves. Yet their eyes remained fixed on the ajar door, unwilling to turn away, as if something beyond it was waiting for them to drop their guard. Behind them, a candle flickered and went out, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. For a moment, the protagonist thought they saw movement there, a brief flicker of shadow against the cold stone wall. But when they turned, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of their own coat and the distant echo of their heartbeat. The protagonist stood frozen in the stillness of the church, their breath clouding the frigid air. The faint sound of the wind howling outside seemed to whisper unintelligible words through the gaps in the church's walls. They glanced back toward the slightly ajar door leading to the bell tower, but decided against venturing further. Something about the silence felt alive, watching, waiting. Instead, their attention was drawn to the old altar at the far end of the church. Its surface was cluttered with remnants of the past, dust-covered candles, crumbling prayer books, and a tarnished crucifix tilted precariously against a wooden stand. As they approached, their foot struck something small and metallic, sending it skittering across the stone floor. Bending down, they retrieved what appeared to be an ornate key. It was long, made of iron, and cold to the touch, with intricate engravings of swirling patterns that almost looked like bells. Turning it over in their hand, they noticed tiny inscriptions etched along the shaft, but the language was unfamiliar, twisted symbols that seemed to shift and blur the longer they looked at them. The key had clearly been abandoned for years, yet the metal gleamed faintly as though it had been polished recently. A chill ran down their spine, and the biting cold seemed to deepen, as if the church were holding its breath. The protagonist's fingers tightened around the key as they glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the shadows. To the left of the altar, an old wooden cabinet caught their eye. It was large, its surface darkened with age, and the edges were chipped as though it had been moved often over the years. The cabinet was locked, but the iron key felt heavy in their pocket, almost as if urging them to try it. With hesitant steps, they approached the cabinet. The air around it felt colder, tinged with the faint scent of something metallic and acrid, like rust and old blood. The key slid into the lock with an eerie ease, the mechanism turning smoothly, despite its apparent age. As the door creaked open, a soft gust of air escaped, carrying with it the musty smell of parchment and decay. Inside was a collection of papers, bound journals, and an assortment of trinkets that looked strangely out of place: frayed ribbons, tarnished coins, and what appeared to be a small hand-carved bell. The bell was black, with a jagged crack running down its side. As the protagonist reached for it, they paused, their hand hovering inches away. The bell seemed to vibrate faintly, almost imperceptibly, and a sudden faint ringing echoed in their ears. Their gaze shifted to the journals, one of which had a cover embossed with the same swirling bell motif as the key. They opened it cautiously, the brittle pages crackling under their touch. The writing inside was uneven and frantic, the ink smeared in places as though it had been written in haste. The first few entries were mundane, a record of prayers, town meetings, and preparations for the Christmas festivities. But as they flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The writing became erratic, filled with warnings and cryptic phrases. "The bells call to us, but not all who hear are blessed. At midnight they will come again. We cannot stop the toll. The last soul was taken. It cannot be undone." The protagonist's heart pounded as they read the final entry, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "To those who find this, the bells are cursed. They bind the town to its past, and no one is safe. If you hear the toll, do not answer. Do not follow, for the toll is a call and the lost will be claimed." Their hands trembled as they shut the journal, glancing back toward the door they had left ajar. The sound of faint footsteps echoed again, closer this time, and they turned sharply. The door to the bell tower was wide open now, the darkness beyond yawning like a mouth. A sudden clang reverberated through the church, making the protagonist jump. The black bell they had left untouched on the shelf had fallen to the ground, its cracked surface somehow producing a deep R. Turning back toward the altar, they noticed something new. Faint footprints in the thin layer of dust, leading from where they stood to the bell tower door. The prints were small, like those of a child, and yet the steps were too precise, too deliberate. They hadn't been there moments ago. They backed away, their breath catching in their throat. The frost on the windows had grown thicker, spreading across the glass like reaching fingers. Within the frost, shapes began to emerge. Faces distorted and twisted in anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. For the first time since entering the church, the protagonist felt truly trapped. The protagonist returned to the cabin after their unsettling discovery in the church, clutching the journal as if it were a shield against the creeping dread. The cozy refuge they once sought felt different now, smaller, darker, and stifling, as though the very air inside conspired to close in around them. They lit the fireplace, its crackling flames offering a fragile barrier against the growing cold. Yet the flickering light cast more shadows than comfort, stretching the furniture into grotesque shapes that swayed as the flames danced. The cabin's old wooden door groaned as it swung shut against the bitter wind, the latch clicking into place with a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence. The protagonist leaned against the counter, trying to make sense of the cryptic warnings etched in the journal. The words felt alive in their mind, pulsing like a heartbeat. The bells call, and the lost shall follow. It started subtly. Faint creak came from the floorboards near the far corner of the room. The protagonist froze, their breath catching in their chest. They strained to listen, their ears picking up every shift of the cabin's settling wood. Another creak followed, this time closer, as though something unseen stepped deliberately. Across the room, "It's just the wind," they whispered to themselves, though their voice betrayed their unease. But the wind outside had stilled, leaving only the faint sound of the snowstorm's distant howl. The silence that filled the space felt unnatural, heavy with an unspoken weight that settled in their chest like ice. The fire flickered violently, casting erratic bursts of light across the room. For a brief moment, the shadow of the chair in the corner seemed to lurch forward, bending unnaturally before returning to its rightful shape. The protagonist blinked, convinced it was a trick of their tired mind. But then, a soft tapping echoed from one of the windows, faint yet deliberate. They turned slowly, their stomach knotting as they approached the frost-covered glass. The patterns etched into the frost had changed, now forming sharp, angular lines that almost resembled runes. They stared for a moment, their breath fogging the glass. Suddenly, the faint tap came again, directly in front of them this time. They stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the table for support. "No," they muttered under their breath, "this isn't happening. It's just the storm." But deep down they knew it wasn't the storm. The single bulb hanging above the table flickered once, twice. "Hello everyone, I am the Dark Storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now?" The night in the town of St. Nicholas was unlike any other. The cold seemed to have a life of its own, creeping through every crack and seam, biting through layers of warmth. A sharp wind swept through the cobblestone streets, carrying with it the faint scent of pine mingled with the metallic tang of ice. It wasn't an ordinary Christmas Eve. Something lingered in the air, an unspoken weight that silenced even the usual chatter of holiday cheer. The bells of St. Nicholas Church, tall and imposing, had not rung yet, though the clock ticked steadily toward midnight. The towering bell tower stood like a sentinel, its frosted windows glinting faintly under the moonlight. Shadows played tricks, stretching and curling across the snow-covered ground as though alive. The town's festive garlands and glowing lanterns seemed to pale in the encroaching darkness. The protagonist, a stranger to this town, stood at the edge of the square, gazing up at the bell tower. They weren't here by choice. A snowstorm had swept through the region, forcing them to seek shelter. The warm inn had offered some comfort, but the cryptic whispers of the townsfolk had piqued their curiosity. Tales of the midnight bells and Their peculiar melody had slipped into every conversation, hushed and fearful. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, discordant hum. It wasn't loud, barely perceptible, but it froze the protagonist in place. Was it the bells? No, it was too early for that. A flicker of movement caught their eye, a shadow darting across the church's frost-covered windows. It was fleeting, yet it sent a chill deeper than the biting cold. As they turned to walk toward the inn, footsteps crunched behind them. Slowly they glanced back. The square was empty, the snow pristine, except for one thing. Footprints leading from the bell tower directly toward them. The air seemed to hold its breath as the hum grew louder, more distinct, as if the bells themselves were calling out to the stranger. The St. Nicholas Church loomed above the town, its frosted spire stretching into the cloudy night sky. Snow fell in thick, whispering flurries, muffling the world in a blanket of cold silence. The protagonist stepped cautiously toward the church, their boots crunching on the icy cobblestones. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed quickly by the swirling wind. The air was sharp and damp, carrying with it the faint metallic tang they had noticed earlier, like the scent of old frozen iron. The square was eerily still, the cheerful lanterns swaying lightly as though touched by unseen hands. The garlands that adorned the buildings now seemed limp, weighed down by the growing frost. Windows, once glowing warmly, were now fogged or darkened, as if the entire town had retreated into hiding. As the protagonist approached the church's heavy wooden door, they noticed the texture of the building. The stone walls were rough, their surfaces cracked and uneven, as though bearing the weight of centuries of secrets. Frost clung to every crevice, forming intricate, almost purposeful patterns. Running their gloved hand along the wall, they felt the cold seep through, a sharp chill that sent an involuntary shiver through their body. Inside, the church was dimly lit, with candles flickering faintly along the stone walls. Their warm glow cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to shift and move independently. The air smelled of old wood, damp stone, and faint traces of incense, though it had been years, perhaps decades, since any service was held here. The protagonists' breath formed misty clouds as they stepped further in, their footsteps reverberating softly across the stone floor. Then came the first sound, a faint creak from somewhere above. The protagonist froze, their heads snapping up toward the bell tower. The sound was light, almost dismissible, like an old wooden beam settling under the weight of snow. But something about it felt deliberate, as though the building itself was aware of their presence. Shaking off the thought, they continued forward, their eyes catching something out of place. On one of the pews sat an old, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and worn, the pages curled with age. The protagonist hesitated before picking it up. The book felt unnaturally cold, even through their gloves, and the faint scent of musty parchment mingled with something acrid, almost like burnt wood. Flipping through the pages, they found faded, scrawled writing, illegible in some places, but certain words stood out. Bells, warning, and final chime. Their stomach tightened as they turned to the last page, which was blank except for a single phrase written in bold, jagged letters. Listen closely, for the toll is not for you. A sharp knock echoed from the back of the church, startling them. They spun around, heart pounding, but the door remained firmly shut. The wind howled outside, rattling the frosted windows. It was likely just the storm, they told themselves, yet the unease in their chest deepened. As they stepped back, toward the main aisle, something caught their eye. One of the large wooden doors leading to the bell tower was slightly ajar. The protagonist was certain it had been closed moments ago. The gap revealed a sliver of darkness that seemed to breathe, the cold draft flowing from it like an exhale. They moved toward it cautiously, each step heavier than the last. From beyond the door came a faint sound, almost imperceptible, a low, mournful hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The protagonist stopped in their tracks, every instinct, urging them to turn back. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt resonating deep within their chest, as though the very air around them was alive and then dimmed. The firelight became the only source of illumination, casting the cabin into shifting, uncertain shadows. The faint ticking of a clock on the mantel grew louder, each second dragging out as if time itself had slowed. Their unease escalated into paranoia. They began to pace, muttering reassurances to themselves that felt hollow even as they spoke them. Then, the door creaked open, just an inch, but enough for the icy wind to sweep in and extinguish the fire. Darkness consumed the room, and for a moment the protagonist felt utterly alone. "Hello?" they called out, their voice trembling in the void. From somewhere deep in the cabin, a faint whisper answered. It was unintelligible, no more than a soft hiss carried on the air, but its presence was undeniable. They fumbled for their flashlight, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. The journal lay open on the table, its pages fluttering as if an unseen hand were flipping through them. A phrase caught their eye, scrawled in bold, frantic letters. "Don't let them in." The words sent a chill racing down their spine. Their flashlight beam caught movement at the edge of their vision, a fleeting shadow slipping along the wall. They turned sharply, but nothing was there. The whisper came again, louder this time, forming the faintest semblance of words. "Help us." The voice was followed by a series of faint, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. 1, 2, 3. No. No. The protagonist stammered, backing away. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from behind them, the floorboards creaked once more, as if something was standing directly behind them. They spun around, but again the room was empty. The frost on the windows had spread, now covering nearly every pane of glass. Within the icy patterns, faint shapes began to emerge, faces, distorted and anguished, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The protagonist couldn't tear their gaze away. The frost began to creep inward, thin tendrils snaking along the wooden walls of the cabin, as if the cold itself were alive. Desperation overtook them. They grabbed the journal, flipping through its brittle pages for anything that could explain what was happening. A single line stood out, written in jagged, slanted script. "The bells toll for the chosen. The frost marks the end." As if on cue, the faint tolling of a bell echoed in the distance, its mournful sound carrying through the night. The protagonists' chest tightened, their heart pounding as the realization dawned. Whatever was outside the cabin was no longer waiting to be invited in. The wind howled once more, rattling the windows with a force that seemed to shake the entire structure. The frost crept closer, the faces within it growing clearer, their eyes following the protagonist wherever they moved. And then the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping, as though a dozen voices were speaking at once. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were calling for the protagonist by name. The cabin, once a refuge, had transformed into a cage, trapping the protagonist in an ever-tightening grip of fear. The frost on the windows glowed faintly, casting a cold, eerie light that barely illuminated the room. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, its ferocity matched only by the growing chaos inside. It began with the shadows, the flickering. Remnants of firelight cast grotesque shapes on the walls, shapes that twisted and stretched unnaturally. One moment they were still, but as the protagonist watched, frozen in place, they began to shift. A figure appeared, a vague humanoid outline that seemed to emerge from the darkest corner of the cabin. "No," they whispered, clutching the journal tighter. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was undeniable. Its head tilted slightly as if observing them, and then in an instant it was gone. The protagonist stumbled back, their breathing shallow and rapid. The frost patterns on the windows seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a heartbeat. Whisper broke through the stillness, faint but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the window, their name spoken softly but with an unnerving familiarity. "Who's there?" they called, their voice trembling. The room remained silent, but the frost on the nearest window began to shift again. This time it formed a single word, etched in jagged, icy lines. "Welcome." The protagonist's breath hitched as the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, circling just out of sight. "Stop this," they muttered, their voice barely audible over the pounding of their heart. But the footsteps grew louder, moving toward them. They spun around, expecting to see something, anything. But the room was empty. The journal slipped from their hands as a sudden crash echoed through the cabin. The old rocking chair by the fireplace had toppled over, its rhythmic creaking replaced by an unsettling stillness. The protagonist moved cautiously toward it, their flashlight beam trembling in their hand. But before they could reach it, another sound cut through the air, a loud resonant bang from the kitchen. They froze, torn between investigating and staying put. The logical part of their mind screamed for them to stay in place, but the pull of curiosity, of needing to know, drew them forward. The kitchen was dark, the faint frostlight casting long, jagged shadows across the countertops. A single cupboard, door hung open, swinging slowly on its hinges. As they reached for it, the door slammed shut with a force that sent them stumbling back. The whisper returned, louder now, accompanied by the faint melodic toll of a bell. "Who's doing this?" They shouted, their voice cracking, but no answer came. Only the sound of something heavy sliding across the floor behind them. Turning quickly, they saw the old trunk in the corner of the room had moved several feet. Its lid was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The frost on its surface formed yet another message. "Open me." The protagonist shook, their head backing away. "No, I won't." But the cabin seemed to disagree. The lid of the trunk creaked open on its own, and from within came the faintest sound of a child's laughter. Light, musical and entirely wrong. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the cabin as the frost on the windows spread further, creeping across the walls. They grabbed the journal again, frantically flipping through its pages. Their hands shook as they found a passage near the end, written in bold, hurried scrawl. "It's not the bells, it's what they bring." The realization hit them like a cold wind. The bells were not the cause of the haunting. They were the warning. The frost patterns on the windows now formed faces, dozens of them, their expressions twisted in silent agony. The protagonist felt their sanity slipping, their thoughts spiraling into paranoia. Was the entity watching them? Was it already inside? Every creak of the floorboards felt like a threat, every flicker of the shadows a reminder of their isolation. The storm outside howled louder, as if mocking their fear. They tried to focus, to think of a way out, but their mind betrayed them, conjuring images of the shadowy figure, the whispering voices, the frost that seemed alive. The journal fell from their hands again as the cabin shook violently, the sound of the bells outside growing deafening. "Please," they whispered, tears streaming down their face. "I just want to leave." But deep down they knew there was no escape, not until the bells tolled their final chime. A sudden movement at the window caught their eye. A figure stood on the other side of the frost-covered glass, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. The frost began to crack, spider-webbing outward as if the entity were trying to break through. The protagonist screamed, backing away as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at them. The journal's final warning flashed in their mind. "The bells call, and the lost shall follow," and as the frost cracked further, the voice returned, soft, melodic, and chillingly close. "It's your turn." The protagonist sat trembling by the fireplace, the journal clutched in their hands as the frost crept further into the cabin. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sound was the rhythmic tolling of the bells in the distance, each chime sending a shiver through their body. They turned the brittle, yellowed pages, desperate for answers. The journal's writing grew more frantic with each entry, the last few pages filled with chilling details about the history of the church bells and their cursed toll. The bells were forged during a time of despair, their chime meant to call salvation. But instead they summoned something else, a shadow, an echo of regret and fear. The bells are its tether, and every toll strengthens its hold. The protagonist's breath hitched as they read further. The writer had been a bell ringer, one of the few who knew the truth. They had witnessed the entity's rise, its ability to prey on the vulnerabilities of those who heard the bells differently. "It sees into your soul," the journal warned. "It knows your secrets, your regrets." The bells call to the broken, the lost. Once marked, there is no escape. The realization hit hard. The faint dissonance they had heard in the bells wasn't just a sound, it was a signal, a warning meant for them. Through the journal's fragmented entries and cryptic drawings, the protagonist pieced together the horrifying truth. The entity was no mere ghost. It was a force born of despair, feeding on the collective fears of the town. Bound to the bells by an ancient ritual gone awry, it existed in the liminal space between sound and shadow. The bells were its gateway, the sound bridging the world of the living and the dead. Every chime thinned the barrier, allowing the entity to slip closer to its victims. The frost wasn't just a chilling effect of the storm, it was the entity's reach, spreading its influence and signaling its presence. The cabin, it seemed, was no ordinary place. Once a sanctuary for the bell ringer, it had become a trap for those who sought refuge. The frost etched on the windows and the cryptic warnings scrawled on the walls were remnants of those who had been there before. "This place is its prison," the journal explained, "and its hunting ground. The bells call the marked here, drawing them closer to the final toll." The protagonist realized the terrible truth. They were not the first, and they would not be the last. The cabin wasn't protecting them. It was holding them until the entity could claim its prize. The frost on the window panes began to shift again, forming images of the protagonist's deepest regrets. Memories they had tried to bury surfaced with brutal clarity. A failed promise, a broken relationship, a moment of hesitation that had cost dearly. Tears streamed down their face as the whispers returned, this time speaking in familiar voices, those of loved ones they had lost or wronged. The words were soft, almost soothing, but laced with accusation. "You could have done more. Why did you leave me? It's your fault." The protagonist slammed the journal shut, shaking their head. "No, it's not real. It's just the storm, it's just the bells." But deep down they knew the truth. The entity wasn't creating these visions, it was drawing them out from within. A sudden, loud crack jolted the protagonist out of their thoughts. The frost on the largest window splintered like a spiderweb, and the shadowy figure from earlier pressed its hand against the glass. Its face was obscured, but its intent was clear. The journal's final entry flashed in their mind. The bells must fall silent. Destroy them and the tether breaks, but beware, the entity will not let go willingly. They looked around the cabin, their heart racing. The tools left behind by the bell ringer might still be there, hidden among the remnants of the past. If they could find a way to silence the bells before the final toll, there might be hope. But the frost had spread across the cabin, and the whispers had turned into low, guttural growls. The shadow behind the glass pushed harder, the pane cracking further under the strain. Time was slipping away. The bells were tolling closer together now, each chime echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat. The final chime would signal the entity's full emergence, and once that happened, there would be no escape. The protagonist stood, clutching the journal like a lifeline. They would have to face the church, confront the entity, and silence the bells before the frost claimed them entirely. But as they stepped toward the door, a new message appeared on the frosted window, scrawled in jagged, icy letters. "You cannot win." With trembling hands, they gripped the door handle, steeling themselves for what lay beyond. The storm outside howled like a living thing, and the bells continued their mournful song. The protagonist knew one thing for certain: they couldn't stay here. To survive, they would have to face the nightmare head-on. The bells' mournful toll echoed across the desolate town, growing softer with each chime, as though the very air was tiring under its weight. The protagonist staggered into the church, their breath visible in the freezing cold, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The shadowy figure was no longer confined to the frost. It moved freely now, an ominous presence trailing behind them, like a second shadow. The air grew denser, and every step toward the bell tower felt like wading through invisible chains. The stairs leading to the bells seemed endless, winding upward into darkness, broken only by faint shafts of moonlight through the stained glass windows. With every step, the tolling grew louder, more discordant, until it was a deafening cacophony that seemed to shake the entire structure. At the top, the bells swung rhythmically, their metal gleaming with a sinister hue. The protagonists stared at them, their minds racing. The journal's final words replayed in their thoughts. The tether must be severed, but at a cost. As they approached the massive bells, the shadowy figure appeared, standing between them and salvation. It no longer needed to hide. Its form was now solid, human-like, but wrong in ways that defied comprehension. Its voice filled the tower, a blend of whispers and screams. "You will not silence us," it hissed, "not without a sacrifice." The figure stepped closer, its hand outstretched. In its palm, the frost swirled and formed an image of someone the protagonist had lost long ago. A voice they hadn't heard in years whispered their name, soft and broken. The entity offered a cruel bargain. Leave the bells untouched, and they could join their loved one in eternal peace, or destroy the bells and lose them forever. Tears blurred the protagonist's vision as they stared at the figure, then at the swinging bells. They clenched their fists, forcing themselves to move. "I won't let you take anyone else," they whispered, their voice trembling but resolute. With one final, desperate effort, they swung the bell's hammer, shattering its surface. The tolling ceased abruptly, and the entity screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce through reality itself. The silence was deafening as the protagonist stumbled out of the bell tower. The town was still, the storm gone, and the snow glowed faintly in the moonlight. The church stood intact, but its bells hung lifeless, their power broken. As they returned to the cabin, the protagonist felt a strange calm, though their chest ached with the weight of their loss. The frost on the windows had melted, leaving streaks that resembled claw marks. But as they sat by the fire, a faint sound drifted through the air, a single, soft chime, as if the bells were not entirely silenced. Far off, in the heart of the Such town, a faint layer of frost began to form on another window pane. A new message appeared, written in icy strokes. "The bells always find another." The forest outside the cabin swayed gently in the wind, carrying whispers that barely brushed the ears. And as the night grew still, the frost crept silently, waiting for the next soul to answer its call. The rain-soaked whispers. They never stopped calling. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, soft yet unrelenting, as if the heavens were whispering secrets to the earth. Each droplet struck the leaves with a faint patter, merging into a haunting symphony. The air carried a damp chill, thick and heavy, laced with the earthy smell of soaked soil and the faint metallic tang of something unseen. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rustling of leaves broke the stillness, as though unseen hands were brushing against them. Maya pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the icy air. The relentless rain had forced her to seek refuge, and the only shelter in sight was a decaying, abandoned cottage at the edge of the woods. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling on the rusted iron gate that hung slightly ajar. Its creak echoed faintly as the wind nudged it back and forth, a mournful sound that seemed to beckon her inside. The cottage stood shrouded in shadows, its wooden walls warped and weathered by years of neglect. The faint smell of damp wood and mildew wafted out, mingling with the cold, stale air that seeped from its cracks. The wind whispered through the broken window panes, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong, a faint, almost imperceptible voice, like a soft sigh carried on the breeze. Maya stepped cautiously onto the creaking porch, her boots leaving faint prints on the slick, rotting wood. As she reached for the doorknob, a flicker of movement caught her eye, something darting, just beyond the edge of her vision. She froze, her heart pounding, as the whispering wind seemed to pause, replaced by a silence so profound it felt alive. And then, from deep within the shadows, came the faintest sound, a whisper. "Come closer." The door groaned as Maya pushed. It opened, the sound cutting through the rain like a low, mournful wail. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of abandonment. Each breath she took was steeped in mustiness, a blend of damp wood, decaying leaves, and something sharper, like charred remains, lingering from a fire long extinguished. Her boots tapped softly against the cold stone floor, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. Rough, uneven walls surrounded her, their surfaces etched with faint streaks of moss and cracks that ran like veins through the decaying structure. The faint drip of water echoed in the distance, rhythmic and precise, as though counting down to some unseen event. Maya hesitated just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through shattered windows. Rain trailed down the glass in jagged patterns, distorting the view of the dense forest beyond. She stepped. Further in, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her weight breaking the eerie quiet. The sound seemed almost too loud, as if the cottage resented her intrusion. A faint whisper caught her attention. It was too soft to discern, yet unmistakably there. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, straining to listen. But the whisper faded into the ambient sound of the rain, leaving her questioning if she'd heard it at all. Her gaze fell on a small table near the corner, tilted slightly on uneven legs. A book lay on its surface, its cover warped and stained. Maya frowned. It looked out of place, too deliberate, too recent, as if someone had left it there for her. Her fingers brushed against the damp, crumbling leather as she lifted it. Ifai. Pages were blank, but the smell of burnt paper clung to them, sharp and acrid. The silence thickened, punctuated only by the faint creaks of the cottage settling around her. As she moved deeper into the room, a chair tipped over in the corner caught her eye. It wasn't just tipped, it was placed that way, balanced precariously, as though frozen mid-fall. Maya's pulse quickened, but she swallowed the rising unease. "It's just the wind," she muttered under her breath, the words doing little to calm her nerves. Her rationalization faltered when she noticed the door at the far end of the room. It stood ajar, revealing only a sliver of darkness beyond. The edges of the doorframe were clawed, deep grooves marring the wood. The scratches were uneven, as though made in a frenzied panic. Maya shivered, an involuntary reaction that had little to do with the cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. She called out, her voice tentative, barely louder than a whisper. "Hello, is anyone here?" The question hung unanswered, swallowed by the silence. Her own voice seemed alien in the stillness, too human for a place that felt so lifeless. Or perhaps too alive. The rain continued its relentless patter against the roof, a soothing rhythm that clashed with the tension crawling beneath her skin. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the ajar door, each step slower than the last. The ground beneath her felt uneven, the stone cold and damp against her soles. A sudden sound, soft, fleeting, came from behind her. She spun around, her breath hitching. The book on the table was now open, its blank pages fluttering gently as if stirred by a breeze, yet the air in the room was still, unmoving. Maya stared at it, her mind grasping for an explanation, but none came. The unease grew sharper, gnawing at her resolve. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, yet something about the whispers, the faintest suggestion of a voice carried by the rain, kept her rooted. She couldn't shake the feeling that the cottage wasn't just a shelter from the storm, it was watching her. A distant creak echoed through the room, this time from the ceiling above. Her eyes darted upward, but the shadows offered no answers. For the first time, Maya felt the suffocating weight of being utterly alone, or perhaps not alone at all. She tightened her grip on the damp book, her knuckles whitening as she whispered to herself, "Just the wind. It's all just the wind." But deep down, she knew better. The air felt too heavy, the silence too deliberate. Something, or someone, was here. And whatever it wasn't hiding. It was waiting. The air in the cottage seemed to press heavier on Maya's chest with each passing moment. Her eyes, though accustomed to the dim light, struggled to make sense of the warped shadows that stretched across the walls. Her boots scuffed softly against the cold stone floor. As she approached the slightly ajar door, the faint scratches on the doorframe lingered in her mind, a silent warning she couldn't ignore. Pushing the door open, Maya stepped into what appeared to be a storage room. It was small and claustrophobic, with a low ceiling and shelves sagging under the weight of time. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the air carried a pungent mixture of mold and decay. Her eyes scanned the room, and that's when she saw it, a trunk. It sat in the center of the room, out of place in its pristine condition. Unlike the rest of the cottage, the trunk's surface was unblemished, its black leather glistening faintly, as if untouched by the years. Brass clasps held it shut, gleaming eerily in the dim light. Maya hesitated, her instincts screaming for her to leave it alone. Yet, curiosity gripped her tighter than fear. She knelt beside it, her fingers brushing, over the smooth leather. It was cold, colder than anything else in the room. Her hand trembled as she unlatched the clasps, the faint click breaking the suffocating silence. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside lay an assortment of objects that didn't belong together. The first was a cracked pocket watch, its face frozen at exactly 3 minutes past midnight. Next to it, a bundle of old, brittle photographs tied with a black ribbon. Maya's fingers hovered over them, but her attention was drawn to a journal lying at the bottom of the trunk. The journal's cover was made of a strange material, neither leather nor fabric, but something in between. It was oddly warm to the touch, as if it had been held recently. A faint, smoky smell emanated from it, like burnt wood mixed with something metallic. Maya hesitated, but a strange compulsion made her pick it up. As she opened the journal, the pages felt dry and fragile, yet they bore no signs of decay. The writing inside was meticulous, almost too perfect. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light, shifting between black and deep crimson. The handwriting was elegant, looping letters that seemed to dance across the page. The first entry read, "To those who find this, heed these words. The rain is their voice, and the whispers are their call. Do not follow where they lead, for what waits beyond the veil is neither living nor dead." Maya's breath caught in her throat. The words sent a shiver racing down her spine. She flipped through the journal, her movements careful yet frantic. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into jagged scratches. Each page carried cryptic warnings, references to the endless call and the drowned ones. One entry stood out. It wasn't written in ink, but appeared as though etched into the page with something, "They come when the rain falls. They are always watching, and they will never stop calling." Maya's hands trembled as she read the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The room felt colder, and for a moment the rain outside seemed to grow louder, as if in response. Suddenly a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the rain. This was different, deliberate, like footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the cottage. Maya froze, her heart pounding. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. She clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. "It's just the wind again," she muttered, but the words felt hollow. The journal's weight in her hands seemed heavier now, as if it carried more than just words. Her thoughts were interrupted by another discovery. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. She carefully unfolded it, revealing a hand-drawn map. It depicted the surrounding forest with a large X marked in the center of what appeared to be a clearing. Scrawled beside the X were 2 chilling words: "Don't follow." Maya stared at the map, her mind torn between fear and an inexplicable urge to uncover the truth. The whispers she had heard earlier seemed to grow louder in her memory, their faint, unintelligible words now feeling like a direct warning. This can't be real, she thought, but the unease clawing at her refused to let go. The journal, the map, the whispers, they were all connected, and the deeper she looked, the darker the mystery became. The rain outside continued its relentless patter, but now it carried a new sound, a faint, almost melodic hum. It was soft, inviting, and impossibly familiar. Maya clenched the journal tightly, her pulse racing. The cottage seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her next move. The air inside the cottage had grown impossibly still, as though it was holding its breath. Maya stood in the dim room, the journal pressed tightly to her chest. Her eyes darted to the shadows pooling in the corners, every movement in the flickering light from the cracked windows playing tricks on her mind. She could hear her heartbeat, loud, insistent, almost drowning out the sound of the rain. And then it started. A faint knock echoed from somewhere above her. It wasn't a random creak of the old structure. It was deliberate, steady. Tap, tap, tap. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound came again, this time louder, as if whatever was making it had moved closer. Her fingers gripped the journal tighter, the leather cover biting into her palms. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. On the roof. Silence answered her. For a moment she considered leaving, but the unease rooting her in place wouldn't let her turn away. The sound shifted. This time it wasn't a knock. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside the room. Each step was accompanied by the faint groan of the wooden floorboards, the sound growing louder with every passing second. Maya's breath quickened, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven gasps. She backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on the dark hallway beyond. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment everything was silent again. But the silence didn't bring relief. It only sharpened her fear, stretching the tension until it was unbearable. And then the whispers began. Faint at first, barely more than the rustle of leaves in the wind, they seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. They were neither loud nor aggressive, but their presence was undeniable. They carried a weight that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her legs trembled as she took a hesitant step toward the doorway, her curiosity warring with her terror. Just as she reached the threshold, the door creaked softly, swinging open on its own. Maya froze, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. The hallway beyond was dark, its edges blurred by shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The whispers grew louder, but no matter how hard she strained to understand them, the words remained just out of reach. She glanced back at the journal in her hands, as though it might hold some explanation, but the weight of the silence around her demanded her attention. Another sound broke through the whispers, a soft thud from behind her. She turned quickly, her eyes landing on the small table where the warped book had been moments earlier. Now the book lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering despite the stillness of the air. Maya's heart pounded as she approached it cautiously. Maya. Writing on the pages had changed. The meticulous script was now jagged, scrawled across the paper in bold, chaotic strokes. A single word stood out, repeated over and over. Leave. Her hands began to shake as she knelt to pick up the book. The instant her fingers touched the pages, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She stood, clutching the book tightly, and turned toward the hallway again. A shadow moved. It was quick, just a flicker at the edge of her vision, but it was enough to send a chill racing down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No response. The hallway remained as still and empty as before, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hall slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the walls. Maya jumped, a startled cry escaping her lips. Her grip on the book tightened as her mind raced. This isn't real. It can't be real. Her denial faltered as another sound reached her ears. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the door that had just slammed shut. Her body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The rain outside grew louder, pounding against the windows like an urgent warning. The scratching stopped, replaced by a new sound, a single knock, sharp and deliberate. Maya's breath caught as the knock was followed by another, and then another, the rhythm steady and unrelenting. With trembling hands, she opened the journal once more. The page she had seen earlier was now blank, as though the words had been wiped away, but beneath her fingertips she felt an indentation, as if something had been written beneath the surface. Slowly, she tilted the page toward the faint light. Streaming in through the window, a single phrase emerged, carved faintly into the paper. "They are here." Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, her mind teetering on the edge of panic. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping, into a cacophony that seemed to surround her. Maya clutched the journal to her chest, her eyes darting between the shifting shadows and the closed door. Whatever was inside the cottage with her, it wasn't going to let her leave. Not yet. The whispers rose and fell like waves, their faint, indecipherable words encircling Maya. She clutched the journal tighter, her knuckles white against the leather cover. Each breath she took was shallow, the air around her heavy with dampness and unease. The rain outside, once soothing, now sounded relentless, hammering against the windows as if trying to break through. Then, without warning, the chair at the far end of the room slid across the floor with a piercing screech. Maya froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The chair moved deliberately, halting in the center of the room, as though placed there by an unseen hand. She took a shaky step back, her mind racing. This isn't real, it can't be real. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of floorboards behind her. Maya spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sound of footsteps stopped abruptly, mere inches away, though no one was there. She felt the air shift, colder now, as if something was standing just out of reach. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with expectation. And then it came, a faint, breathy voice that sent chills racing down her spine. Maya. Her name hung in the air, fragile and haunting. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but the intimacy of it was unbearable, as though whoever or whatever had spoken was standing right beside her. She backed away, her foot catching on the uneven floor, sending her stumbling against the wall. The journal slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud. As it hit the floor, its pages fluttered open, revealing a new message scrawled in jagged letters. "They see you." Maya pressed herself against the wall, her breathing ragged. Her thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. How is this happening? Am I imagining it? Is this all in my head? The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, the corners stretching deeper than they should. The whispers returned, louder now, their overlapping voices filling the room with an unbearable cacophony. The objects around her seemed to tremble, the small table rattling as if shivering under an unseen weight. The photograph she had seen earlier slid off the table, its black ribbon unraveling as it hit the ground. Summoning what little courage she had left, Maya bent down to pick up the photo. Her fingers brushed against its surface, and her breath hitched. The image wasn't what she had seen before. Instead of the faded family portrait, the photograph now showed her, standing in this very room, staring at the camera with wide, terrified eyes. Her knees threatened to give way, but she forced herself upright, clutching the photo tightly. Her rational mind scrambled for explanations, but each one slipped away like sand through her fingers. This can't be happening, this can't be real. The tipping point came when the door at the far end of the hallway creaked open, slowly and deliberately. Maya's eyes locked on the darkness beyond, her body frozen in place. A figure stood there, barely more than a silhouette. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, watching. The rain outside intensified, the sound deafening now, as though the storm itself was closing in. The figure stepped forward, one deliberate step at a time, the floorboards creaking beneath its weight. Maya wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, her voice caught in her throat. The figure stopped mere feet from her, its form still obscured by shadow. Then, as if the air itself carried the message, a whisper brushed against her ear. "Why did you come?" Words shattered whatever resolve she had left. Maya bolted, her legs finally responding. She stumbled toward the front door, her hands fumbling with the rusted knob. It wouldn't budge. Behind her the whispers surged, now a torrent of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Objects crashed to the floor, the walls groaned, and the figure moved closer. Tears streamed down her face as she pounded on the door. "Let me out," she screamed, her voice breaking. The journal lay open on the floor behind her, the words on its pages shifting and rearranging. One final message stared back at her. "It's too late." The rain outside stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Maya turned slowly, her back pressed against the unyielding door. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, soft now, almost comforting. They surrounded her, weaving through the air like a lullaby, and then the room plunged into darkness. The oppressive silence that followed the rain's sudden cessation was deafening, a void filled only by the rhythmic pounding of Maya's heart. Her back remained pressed against the door, her trembling hands searching for stability as she stared into the blackness that now enveloped the room. The whispers had quieted to faint murmurs, fading in and out like a dying signal. Yet their presence was undeniable. The journal lay on the ground where she had dropped it, its pages splayed open to a new entry that hadn't been there before. Gathering what little courage she had left, Maya knelt to retrieve it, her fingers brushing over the coarse paper. The ink glistened faintly in the dim light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The words chilled her to the core. The rain is their bridge. The whispers are their anchor. Those who hear them are chosen not by fate but by consequence. Her eyes scanned the page frantically as more lines began to appear, written by an unseen hand. They drowned here long ago, their lives claimed by a storm that came too suddenly, too violently. They call to us, to anyone who dares enter this place, hoping to find peace or vengeance. Maya's breath hitched. She flipped back through the journal, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. In her mind, the scratched doorframe, the strange arrangement of the objects, the map with the ominous "don't follow." These were not random. They were warnings, breadcrumbs left by someone else who had been caught in the same web. Her fingers brushed against the map tucked into the back of the journal. This time, something about it felt different, heavier, more insistent. She unfolded it, noticing new details that hadn't been there before. The X marking the clearing was now accompanied by faint lines like trails leading from the edges of the map toward the center. Around the X were symbols she couldn't decipher, jagged shapes that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, low and distant but clear. "It's where they wait." Maya whipped around, but no one was there. The voice seemed to come from the air itself, reverberating like an echo trapped between the walls. Her grip on the journal tightened as she tried to process the implications of what she'd read. The rain connects them. The whispers bind them. The words circled her mind like a mantra. A creak from above startled her. Slowly, cautiously, she followed the sound, her footsteps tentative on the creaking floorboards. The hallway she had avoided earlier now seemed to beckon her, its shadows less like barriers and more like invitations. At the end of the hallway, the door that had slammed shut earlier stood slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading down. Maya hesitated, every fiber of her being screaming to turn back. But something compelled her forward, a mix of curiosity and inevitability she couldn't resist. She descended the stairs, her steps echoing in the narrow passage. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a damp metallic smell that clung to her skin. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a hidden cellar. The space was small and unremarkable at first glance, but in the center stood a circular stone well, its edges worn smooth by time. The whispers returned, louder now, spiraling out of the darkness within the well. They overlapped, their tones pleading, accusing, sorrowful. Maya approached cautiously, peering into the well's depths. The water at the bottom shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not her face, but a swirling mass of images, faces, places, fragments of moments lost to time. A journal entry's words echoed in her mind. They are neither living nor dead. As she stared into the water, the whispers became clearer, forming coherent words. "Help us, free us, they won't let us go." Maya recoiled, her pulse racing. She turned to leave, but her gaze fell on the wall beside the well. Scratched into the stone were rows of names, etched hastily, as if by desperate hands. Among them, one name stood out, her own. Her knees nearly buckled. How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The journal's cryptic warnings now made sense. This wasn't just a random encounter. She had been drawn here, chosen by forces she couldn't comprehend. The whispers rose in intensity, their pleas mingling with accusations. "You brought the rain. You heard us. You must end this." The weight of their voices pressed down on her, a heavy burden of responsibility and guilt she couldn't understand. She stumbled backward, her mind a storm of fear and confusion. The shadows seemed to close in, and she knew something inevitable was approaching. Her hand brushed against the journal again, and one final message appeared, etched in crimson ink. To end it, you must face them. The cellar began to tremble, the stone well at its center pulsing with unnatural light. Maya knew she had no choice. Whatever waited in the depths of the well, it held the answers she sought, and the danger she feared most. The trembling in the cellar grew more violent, the ground beneath Maya's feet shifting as though the earth itself was rejecting her presence. The whispers surged into a deafening roar, filling the air with desperate cries and unrelenting pleas. The well pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its depths swirling with chaotic light and shadows. Maya stood frozen at the edge of the well, her mind a cacophony of fear and defiance. The journal's final message, "To end it, you must face them," echoed in her thoughts. Her hands shook as she clutched the book, the cold leather biting into her palms. Taking a deep breath, she leaned over the well and whispered, "I'm here, show me." The light in the well surged, blinding her momentarily. When her vision cleared, the cellar was gone. She stood in a vast, featureless void, surrounded by shadowy figures. Their faces were blurred, their forms wavering as if caught between existence and oblivion. They encircled her, their whispers now distinct voices that overlapped in a chorus of anguish and accusation. One figure stepped forward, its form more defined than the others. It raised a hand, and Maya felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow crash. Over her, a flood of memories that weren't hers. She saw flashes of lives lost in the storm, the fear, the desperation, the silence that followed. These were the drowned, trapped in a cycle of torment, their spirits bound to the rain that had taken them. "You hear us," the figure said, its voice soft yet resonant. "You must decide. Will you set us free, or will you join us?" Maya's breath caught. Her heart pounded as the weight of their plight settled on her shoulders. She reached for the journal, its pages flipping of their own accord, until they stopped on a single word: choose. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "How?" The figures stepped back, their forms dissolving into the swirling void. The well reappeared before her, its surface now calm and reflective. Slowly her own face emerged in the water, but it wasn't the face she knew. It was pale, ethereal, her eyes hollowed by an otherworldly glow. The truth hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't here to save them. She was already part of them. The void collapsed around her and the cellar returned. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of rain once more. But the cottage was different now, silent, still, and empty. The journal lay on the ground where she had dropped it, its pages blank. As Maya turned to leave, she paused at the door. The rain had stopped, and the air was eerily calm. But just as she stepped outside, a faint whisper carried on the wind reached her ears. "We'll be waiting." The scene faded into darkness, the only sound the gentle patter of rain returning. In the distance. In the end, it's not the storm that lingers, it's the whispers that follow, soft as the rain and just as relentless.